What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is Nate Silver. Nate is a well-known political forecaster, statistician, and poker player who founded the website FiveThirtyEight and has authored 2 books on statistics and probability, The Signal and the Noise, and On the Edge, The Art of Risking Everything. In the episode's first hour, Nate and I discuss the political battle currently taking place between Silicon Valley elites and the coastal establishment of DC insiders and legacy media journalists. We discuss the internecine political movements of effective altruism and accelerationism within Silicon Valley, the loss of faith in political institutions, the polarizing risk preferences of Americans, and what all of this reveals about the nature and soundness of our political economy heading into the 2024 US elections. In the second hour, we discuss those elections in great detail, including the tightness of the presidential race and who Nate believes is best positioned to win the presidency in November. We debate Kamala's choice for vice president, the pros and cons of J.D. Vance as Trump's VP pick, Kamala and Trump's respective approaches to doing media, favorability scores, swing state strategies, and much more. If you want access to that part of the conversation, and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second hour of today's episode by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. All of our content tiers give you access to our premium feed, which you can listen to on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this amazingly insightful and intimate conversation with my guest, Nate Silver. Nate Silver, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you so much. Happy to be on.
It's great having you on. Actually, we're in a different studio. I haven't done in-studio recordings very often since the pandemic, since we moved out of New York City. And I was planning on being here anyway this week, and so we booked this in person. So it's actually great to meet you.
It's a 6-block walk for me, so that's perfect. But
yeah, it wasn't far from me either. So I'm really excited to have you in studio. Congratulations on the launch of your new book. It's going to be coming out the day after this recording airs. It's called On the Edge, and what is the subtitle of the book?
The Art of Risking Everything.
Great. So I told you this was a great book.
I really appreciate that.
No, it really is. It's a great book. It's so much different than what I expected, and we're going to get into it. We're going to spend the first hour or the first part of the podcast talking about the book, and then we'll get into a conversation about the 2024 election. I told you that when I read the book, well, first of all, I want to know what led you to want to write it, and I would just say for listeners, my experience of reading the book is that it's essentially, how I would describe it, is that it's essentially an expose of a certain set of ideas about why we're so divided as a country that stereotypes people in a way that's rather novel. I think is actually interesting, right? You're used to stereotyping people in terms of age, gender, race, education. This is a different way of doing that, which is really interesting. And there's also a subtle moral argument, which is super fascinating that I also want to get into. But first of all, one, does that accurately capture what you feel the book was about? And 2, what led you to want to write this book?
Yeah, to answer the second part of that question first. I mean, I think it's a book that is well reported, I think, and has a lot of fascinating and complicated people. And so, I'm trying not to be too heavy-handed with things, right? People are allowed to speak in their own words a lot, and the kind of stories speak for themselves instead of me, it's a show, not tell, is kind of the classic piece of writing advice. The motivation, though, was partly kind of feeling adrift in the world of kind of covering politics for a living, maybe feeling a little bit adrift at my previous job, which was with FiveThirtyEight at ABC News, and feeling adrift in the pandemic, which was hard for everybody, I think, but, poker has always been kind of my happy place, I think. It was a way I made my living for a few years in the aughts. And then a way that I kind of found sanity, I guess, away from the day job and the other stressors in my life. And so it kind of started there. I mean, I pitched a couple of different ideas to my publisher. One was a book about gambling. One was a book about game theory. One was a book about artificial intelligence. And the book actually contains some of all three, but it's mostly about gambling and risk, obviously. And the first thing I did was kind of fly down to a poker tournament in Florida, which is kind of every bit as much of a shit show as you might expect. It's like April 2021, so things are still in a pandemic, right? People are supposed to be wearing masks at the casino. Whether they are or not is another question. And yet this poker tournament draws a record number of players. People have pent up angst, or people who want to compete and gamble and take risk have felt like very stymied in the pandemic, I think. And kind of just building out from there, like the type of person I know in poker, it's a person who's really analytical, but also super competitive. These people exist kind of in other spaces that the book covers too. They exist in finance, they exist in crypto, they exist even in AI. I mean, Sam Altman or somebody is a really competitive person who wants to win and be first to market with his product, etc. So yeah, it's like figuring out that like this is an actual typology of a person. I call people in this environment, I call it the river. The reason it's the river, it's a poker term. So poker kind of originated in the Mississippi riverboats back in the mid 19th century.
Like that movie Maverick with Mel Gibson.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, and like the last card of a Texas Hold'em hand is called the river, is the last card that's dealt. But it's kind of a region where, once you see this typology, then you kind of can't unsee it really. And again, the key combination is on the one hand, being really analytical to break problems down, to be able to draw abstract principles from something, to build models. But on the other hand, being really competitive and risk-taking. And those things don't always go hand in hand. Sometimes you think of people who are analytical as being cautious, like an actuary type or calculating. That's not this typology, though. It's people who are hell-bent on on proving something to the world or proving something to themselves and competing.
So let's break this metaphor apart. As you said, it's built around this concept of a river, and you actually there are like 4 different archetypes within this construct, actually 5. You have people that are upriver, mid-river, downriver. Then you have the archipelago, which is basically like degens.
Yeah, there's a lot of degens everywhere, but like the archipelago is like unlicensed gambling and some of the crypto things
GME.
Like that. Yeah, pure degen. Whereas upriver is like, a lot of probability theory has like origins in gambling. A lot of game theory, maybe the most important concept in economics, was derived from von Neumann kind of wanting a better theory for how poker games are played. So it has intellectual origins, but the further you go downstream, kind of literally, metaphorically, I guess, the more kind of like brackish the water gets and the more it just kind of devolves into degenerative gambling. You know what I mean? Yeah, no,
that's so true. And actually, my most recent episode, I was telling you about it with Jay Doe and Farmer. Him and his friend were, I think, the creators of the first, at least wearable computer. It was a computer that they had built to wear while they were at the casino in the 1970s to try and guesstimate the likelihood that the ball on a roulette wheel would fall on a particular number.
Yeah.
So it's actually true, and it's rather fascinating. So let's start with upriver. I also didn't mention the village just real quick, does the village fall on the river?
No, the village is kind of the rival community. And we'll talk about that. And the village is kind of academia, media, government, usually progressive politics. It's kind of the rival, though it's important to keep in mind that both these groups are groups of elites, right? I've talked to some of the wealthiest people in America for the book and things like that are, VCs and so forth. So it's competing groups of elites that are battling it out on Twitter and other platforms for influence and power. But the people in the river are the ones with a lot more money, usually, because their skill set, the ability
upriver or midriver or downriver, but not
midriver. We'll talk about maybe a little bit. I mean, there's some people who have done well in crypto, but we can talk about each of these kind of sub-communities.
Right. So let's first start with upriver. As I was able to understand reading the book, that sort of breaks into effective altruists and rationalists, and the rationalists also break up into a subgroup of accelerationists. Is that right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about this group first. First of all, what is effective altruism? This is like a term that's gotten so much attention, especially with Sam Bankman-Fried. What is this term? What does it mean? And how do these people differ from rationalists, and what are rationalists?
So I define the term effective altruism as a brand name, essentially. It was kind of a clever brand name created by Will MacAskill and Toby Ord, who are professors at Oxford.
Toby's also been on the podcast, actually.
Yeah, Toby's great. So it's kind of what it sounds like. I mean, the idea is that people donate all this money to charity. How can you do that more effectively, right? If you give to the American Red Cross or something like that, or the March of Dimes, are they actually using that charity money effectively, and how much good is it ultimately doing?
Just real quick, when was this term first developed?
I think in the late 2000s, early 2010s. It hasn't been around for that long, right? I mean, some of the ideas, I think Bill Gates, for example, for years has thought about more effective giving, but this brand name is somewhat new. However, once you start to get in the paradigm of, how do we do the most good for the most people, then there's really no limit on that, which is kind of both a strength and a weakness, right? So they'll also think about things like, hey, why don't we evaluate statistically whether you should eat animals or not, which requires us to put a value on an animal life relative to a human life and how much you enhance human happiness and things like that, for example.
Which creates some perverse outcomes. Like if you're able to eat animals, maybe you should be having sex with them. That's actually something you explore.
Can get into weird territory, right? Or like some people I know, some EAs I know won't eat chicken, but will eat beef because you can get a lot of meals out of one cow, but only one out of one chicken, only a couple out of one chicken, right? And maybe the chickens are smarter according to some brain size study. So you get into really weird territory.
And also you end up prioritizing the value of an elephant life over a human life.
Yeah,
elephants
have more neurons than humans. So therefore, an elephant, or maybe I think some species of whales, orcas, sperm whales or something might be up there too. So they think about a lot of things that people don't usually try to quantify. As a kind of quantitative person myself, I sort of appreciate that, but I also understand that models frequently break and go wrong and are very driven by assumptions a lot of the time. Rationalists are kind of a broader set of people. There are people who use the term. Eliezer Yudkowsky is a very well-known, very smart AI researcher who has been worried about artificial intelligence risks since literally 2000, before it was like a thing for most people. He uses that term, and it kind of just describes, again, people who are trying to quantify everything, people who are trying to be less biased is a term you'll sometimes use. And they are concerned about things like existential risks, so really high impact stuff like nuclear war or AI risk or climate change, depending on who you talk to. They're really into markets, however. They like prediction markets. I, by the way, consult for a prediction market site called Polymarket. But because that's a way to actually gamify and quantify anything from who will Kamala Harris pick as her vice president to will there be a recession to what will be the outcome of the war in Ukraine or things like that. So I wouldn't call myself an effective altruist. Probably by default, I'm kind of in the rationalist space, not as a movement. And I think actually kind of one problem with this movement is that it's a small community, and maybe a community that is much stronger on some skills than others. So traders or poker players have to develop to survive some street smarts. I'm not sure that the EAs or the rationalists have as much street smarts, which is, I think, part of the reason that the EAs were conned by Sam Bankman-Fried, I think, is they kind of assume that everyone is nice and everyone is well-intended, and then that's not the way that the world works. But at the same time, they're smart people. They have encouraged people like Bill Gates or even Elon Musk for a period of time, or Warren Buffett, to use their money more effectively. Mark Zuckerberg's another example, which does a lot of net good for the world. So at the margins, I think they've been pretty helpful. They were also early in the game in understanding the importance of AI. But at the same time, sometimes they verge into gullibility, I guess I'd say.
Yeah. So how do accelerationists fit in this? They're a subgroup of rationalism. Actually, I think what's also useful to think about is some people might be listening to this and they might say, so I guess then aren't effective altruists actually a subgroup of rationalists? But I would say that from my understanding of the book, the difference there is moral philosophy. And so the altruists are much more focused on how much good can they do, whereas rationalists is just it's... Yeah,
they can quantify things for their own selfish purposes.
So what's an accelerationist?
An accelerationist is someone who believes that we should have no holds barred on developing AI. Even if it leads to super intelligent AI, they think that will do more good than harm. Even if that sometimes means that we give up control as humans to these super intelligent machines. All these terms are kind of a little vague. So sometimes accelerationist just means that
move fast and break things.
Classic Silicon Valley pro-technology argument. And I'm kind of halfway on board with that, right? Not fully, but halfway. The more extreme forms of accelerationism, where it's hey, actually it would be good if the computers kill all human beings because they'll be smarter than us and kind of incorporate our knowledge anyway. That's a very extreme form, obviously, and at the other end of that spectrum.
So maybe it would be helpful also for people to associate these stereotypes with actual individuals. So like Sam Harris, for example, would probably fall in the category of being an effective altruist. Is that a correct categorization?
I don't know if Sam would. I mean, the Oxford guys are the kind of classic
Toby,
example.
maybe even Nick Bostrom.
Maybe Nick. I mean, although Nick is kind of, a little bit more politically incorrect than some of them, right? Yeah.
So what about someone like David Sachs?
I think he'd be a Riverarian. I mean, because we're getting broader and broader here, right? I mean, certainly people in Silicon Valley have a lot of these characteristics. So when I first started working on the book, I thought it'd be more about like Wall Street. And it turns out that Silicon Valley more embodies these principles, I think. I mean, the whole thing about being independent-minded to the point of being contrarian, to the point of sometimes being difficult. Some of these founders and some of the VCs are people that don't mind getting in arguments, and I'm pretty combative myself, so I sympathize with that. Yeah, look, I mean, this is why I use the term the river as opposed to the village. The village is the oppositional community. That's like a small town where people know one another, and it's kind of organized, and there's like a social hierarchy.
Small, although probably most of humanity fits in the village, right?
No, most of humanity is neither of these. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I was question I was going to ask you. Wanted to get clarification because that's the missing piece. So the village is basically just. So then, how do we differentiate? And I'm sorry for listeners, but this is actually useful because this is basically the core of the book. Is this framework.
There's literally a map in the book.
So then let's talk about the village for a moment here. What exactly is the village?
I think the quintessential village institutions are like the New York Times and Harvard University, right?
So it's people with an educational degree.
People with education.
Coastal citizens usually.
Coastal usually.
Yuppies? Are these yuppies? Is that...
Sometimes, but although they usually upper middle class, right, in practice. I mean, you usually don't get rich by being in academia or journalism, but you have a nice, comfortable life. And they're increasingly blue. I mean, they're the expert class is one way to put it. But they don't have the same skin in the game that like people in the river might, right? They're kind of, if they use models, it's kind of for more abstract reasons.
So this fascinates me because I have noticed people, a good example, someone like Balaji Srinivasan, David Sachs too. There are a lot of these folks who are from the traditionally Valley communities who really have ongoing conflict with this sort of group of people. And it seems like one of the sources of grievance is that the village folks, these sort of yuppies, whatever you want to call them, really do a lot of hit pieces on Silicon Valley.
Yep.
And so what exactly is this drama? Could you explain what this drama is really about?
I think it's a lot of things. I mean,
is that narrative actually pretty accurate? That pretty much this has largely been a one-way arrow where like these folks in media and stuff had just kind of decided to go after the rich sort of Silicon Valley winners of the last 2 decades?
Yeah, look, I mean, part of it is plain old self-interest, I think, where like, if you're in Silicon Valley, you want an administration that's more friendly to tech, and you want friendlier press coverage, and you want lower taxes and things like that. So it's partly just self-interest. I mean, if you read the history of Elon Musk's like falling out with the Democratic Party, there's a lot behind it, but partly because, Biden's gone pretty hard on like Tesla because it's not unionized and things like that, right? But it's also a personality conflict. People in the village tend to be very concerned about their social status in a way that kind of makes them kind of prone to groupthink and pretty risk averse about like not wanting to like offend the wrong people. And of course, Silicon Valley is just the opposite of that. It's think different. It prides itself on being willing to indulge dumb ideas, because if you have one great idea in a batch of 100 dumb ideas, and the great idea makes you 1,000x your investment in Google or something, or SpaceX, then the math of that works out really well for you in terms of expected value. And so it really is like a personality clash and a cultural clash that's also become an economic clash and a clash for power and attention. I mean, Elon Musk, like, why did Elon Musk buy Twitter? I mean, not really as a financial investment. It's apparently not doing all that well as a financial investment, but to have influence, to kind of be like a fox in the henhouse, so to speak, inside this prized institution that once belonged in the village and has now been kind of reclaimed, right? And all the people are kind of on his turf now. And so it's, again, I don't think the return on investment is going to be very good, but as like a cultural play, kind of brilliant in its own weird way.
Yeah, it's really fascinating what's going on culturally in this country when it comes to these communities, which is why this book was so interesting in providing a framework that I just hadn't really seen anywhere else. Also, I think the the villagers sort of have this sense that they're sort of morally superior. Their views are morally superior, and that really obviously grates on people. I want to mention two books, one of which you definitely covered, and another one which discusses some of what you also talked about in the book, like you talked about Thiel and Musk and their time at PayPal and X. I'm talking about X was Elon's company that merged with PayPal. That was a book, Founders, by Jimmy Soni, who's actually been on the podcast. That was his second appearance, not the one about Claude Shannon. And you also covered Sebastian Malaby's book, Power Law, which again covers a lot of the stuff that you talk about in the book with respect to risk-taking in the Valley. Are VCs and founders more sensitive to people's negative opinions about them than normal people?
I think so. I think part of it is because to be a successful founder, you have to have some type of a chip on your shoulder. Josh Wolf, who's a VC in New York, I think has invented the phrase chips on shoulders, put chips in pockets. To be somebody who doesn't stop after your first big success and says, I want more, I want to parlay this small fortune I made, like Elon Musk did, into bigger and bigger fortunes and keep doubling down 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times over. I mean, that's like not necessarily a normal trait. In some ways, it's kind of irrational because once you reach a certain point of fame and success, right, you have, a hot wife and 2 houses and and all the gadgets you could ever want, then at some point you encounter pretty strong diminishing returns. But a lot of these guys had, and they are mostly guys, we can talk about that, had some degree of trauma in their childhood. I mean, Elon Musk, for example, had a difficult father, and like Jeff Bezos was like adopted, and Peter Thiel was, gay and closeted until
Josh was raised by a single mother.
Yeah. Yeah. Because the people who are kind of born on third base will just kind of, gently walk home and with a trust fund or something, right? Now, it's also the people who are at least in the arena. I mean, it's not, these are people who have a certain amount of social status and privilege. I don't want to get too into the wokeness stuff, but like, it helps, I think, still in Silicon Valley to be like a white man or an Asian man that's, probably weighted too heavily in terms of when they're picking where their money goes.
Especially in venture.
Yeah, for sure. But they are people who were not, the 10 richest people in the world are all self-made, which is new. It used to be that if you looked at like the Forbes or Fortune 500 or whatever list, Forbes 400 richest people, it was like, 2/3 inherited wealth. And now it's about 2/3 the other direction.
Yeah, Elon's story is crazy. I mean, you tell that story again. I think Jimmy also told that story where Thiel and Musk are driving in Musk's McLaren that he had bought after his exit from, what was that company that he first sold? Where he made like a significant...
It's before the first...
He made a significant amount of money. You actually also quoted his girlfriend at the time or his fiance from that CNN interview that they did on the street. And he totaled the car. It's such a great story because Thiel realized in that moment, he's like, wow, like Elon was aware that there were other people who had the same car who killed themselves driving it. And he just never considered the possibility that could happen to him. No,
and there's actually this archetype. I mean, there were actually some famous like car accidents in Silicon Valley because you get, risk-taking young rich guys. What do? They buy fancy new cars and and sometimes total them and kill themselves, even not intentionally, but like that's like an archetype, a kind of well-known archetype in Silicon Valley, actually.
Yeah. So you also do this great job in the book of again, there's so much stereotyping, and I mean that in the positive sense of stereotyping. And you also look into differences between VCs and founders, and you categorize them as foxes and hedgehogs. Again, I want to recommend an episode I did with Daniel Dresner back in the day on the difference between intellectuals and thought leaders. And thought leaders fall in the category of hedgehogs because they know one thing and they know it really well. And intellectuals are foxes. You describe VCs as more fox-like and founders as more hedgehog-like. What is this concept and why did you use it here?
So it's actually a concept that I also used in my first book, The Signal and the Noise. It comes from, you mentioned the quote, right? A hedgehog knows one big thing, a fox knows many little things. So a fox is kind of a jack of all trades. A fox solicits input from different sources and kind of merges and does this kind of averaging function in their head a little bit.
Like I'm much more fox-like. I mean, I can just say, having read that.
I mean, having a podcast where you're like talking to people in all these different areas, right? And fitting, I mean, that's extremely fox-like. Whereas if you have a podcast that was just like about like the New York Knicks, and that's all you ever talked about was the New York Knicks in the podcast, and there could be like an earthquake, and you'd be like, let's talk about the Knicks, how it affects the Knicks. Like that would be more hedgehog-ian, I think. So founders have to be very hedgehog-like because they are like literally going all in on one big idea. And the time horizons are very long, meaning, it took SpaceX like 13 years to earn a profit or something. So to say, I'm going to take one big idea and devote my life to it, even though it probably will fail, like that requires someone who is very all in on things. And they also have to be like a kind of true believer. I talked to Paul Graham, who is the founder of Y Combinator, and he's like, yeah, founders have to be optimists. Even though in most walks of life, you just want to be well calibrated. There's no bonus by being overly optimistic when it isn't warranted. You have to enlist other people to work for you. I mean, no business is an island unto itself with one person. And so therefore, that's that personality type. Whereas the foxes are VCs who hear hundreds of pitches and have to decide on them quickly and have to know how to, like, if you have a founder who's struggling in some business like you don't know very much about, how can you kind of still give them decently good advice, or how can you connect them with your network or whatever else? And they worry about, we were almost getting at this before, the kind of expert class is one that Silicon Valley is skeptical of, right? They think that after a certain period of time, experts miss the forest for the trees and or becomes kind of corrupting in a way, right? That your goal becomes to preserve your role as an expert and not actually to make accurate forecasts.
Yeah, and I think also guys like hedge fund managers would fall clearly in the Fox category.
Yeah.
Do we need both of these people, these types of stereotypes? And is there an optimal percentage breakdown? And I don't mean VCs and founders, but sure, let's talk about VCs and founders, or that category within Silicon Valley, and also broadly people that are hedgehog-like and people that are fox-like.
I think what society needs is people who are both risk-taking and risk-averse. I mean, in general, it's the risk-takers who push society forward into inventing new things and society changing and things like that, right? At the same time, we have seen what happens when you have unbridled risk-taking in the form of someone like Sam Bankman-Fried. Elon Musk certainly is not in the same category as SBF, but pushes boundaries and might be better off with some restraint. You don't want everyone in society to be like that.
But do we have any, because it was something I was thinking about, which is like, and this is probably very difficult to find data for, but like you take, stereotypically Japanese society is seen as like more risk averse, right? And you compare it to like America, or like, are there any historical examples that you came across of, certain societies were like hyper risk taking and like what happened to them, and other societies that were like super risk averse?
No, I mean, the US is exceptional in this regard. And if you kind of look at like the three locations where the book takes place are basically Las Vegas for obvious reasons, Silicon Valley for obvious reasons, and then Miami/South Florida, because like that was kind of the peak of the kind of crypto boom, which kind of occurred in the midst of my writing the book, basically. So there's fun, yacht parties in Miami and things like that. Those three places all have a lot of people who migrate there, including a lot of immigrants, right? Miami has like the highest percentage of immigrants of like any city in America, for example, because it's not a cliche that people do actually look at America as a land of opportunity and our attitude toward risk is different. If you look at our data versus Europe's, for example, our economy is growing faster than Europe's for the past 10 years. Theirs has barely grown at all. However, our life expectancy has stagnated while theirs is still growing. So we're kind of making this trade-off of like more, but in exchange for, a less healthy lifestyle sometimes. Yeah, some overwhelming percentage, I have the exact stat in the book, an overwhelming percentage of the world's unicorn companies are located in this 50 by 50 box in California. It's kind of crazy, actually. I mean, it makes sense to have like a focal point where kind of all the talent goes. And by the way, if AI is as important as people in Silicon Valley think it will be, that's going to, further, I think, entrench America's leadership position, and to some extent, maybe China's. But, there's not a lot of AI development going on in Europe right now, for example.
Yeah, so that you brought up two interesting ideas. One, I would just say that I think, so to your point about Europe, I think if the European Union didn't exist, which has been a source of cultural disruption in Europe and homogeny at the sort of supranational level, if that didn't exist, I think that the dynamics that we're describing today would have also led to more cultural stability in Europe, again, also Xing out immigration. So I think that these kind of trade-offs also can destabilize society because you have too much change coming too quickly. But I do have a question which is about contrarianism. So people in Silicon Valley like to think that they're very contrarian, but they also tend to come across also as very group-thinky.
I agree. I think they are. I mean, this is in Sebastian Malaby's book, right? Where like literally they kind of all have offices on like the same road, Sand Hill Road, and like they go over to one of their houses for dinner and things like that. And it's like a very, very small group, right? These big VC firms might have, a dozen partners or something. It's not like Goldman Sachs or something where they have hundreds of partners, right? It's a very small number of people who know each other well. And to some extent, they're also trying to anticipate one another's taste. Because, if I invest in the first round of investment, a Series A or whatever, right, you're hoping to have multiple rounds in the future, and that usually is from different people. And so, I liken it to like going to like a nightclub, and you're trying to find the nightclub that is new and novel, but also not so ahead of the curve that no one's going to be there and you'll look lame by taking your friends to this empty club or something like that, right? So they have very keen social radar in their communities. I mean, I do think they're pretty uncorrelated with the rest of society. That's why they don't kind of trust the expert class. But yeah, they're within Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of conformity. It's just conformity that isn't aligned with the village or the rest of mainstream society.
Yeah, it is super interesting. So how much have you thought about the broader cultural impact that Silicon Valley culture is having? People like Elon Musk or David Sachs and the All-In Group are having on the political conversation and on this sort of like intra-elite competition between the traditional villagers and now this new class of folks who also in some ways hope to be represented through J.D. Vance, who comes in some ways from that culture. I mean, have we seen this before in American history? Like, did we see this, for example, in the robber baron period?
So I'm not a student of that period. I mean, look, in some ways, super wealthy people tend to be politically conservative, right? Not culturally conservative. I think what happened is that you had a period where, look, in the George W. Bush kind of family values era, then, Silicon Valley was, very pro, gay and trans rights and things like that. It's kind of anti-racism and things like that. I mean, Trump, however, has de-emphasized some of this stuff. He's de-emphasized certainly, gay marriage has not been on the table as an issue for some period of time. Roe v. Wade might be a big thing that pushes people in Silicon Valley back toward the Democrats, it being overturned, I should say. However, Trump has tried to de-emphasize that a little bit. And there are these kind of other cultural touchstones. I mean, you kind of touched on this before, but like one of the problems with the village is kind of the sense of superiority, that superiority complex a little bit. And I think that's kind of a turnoff for a lot of voters. Even like little things like, the number of people who are crypto voters is pretty small, right? It's not that many people, but, Democrats tend to do things to want to regulate crypto and kind of the river is like, hey, why not? I mean, it's, and Trump has recognized that and like, oh, here's 1% of the electorate might vote based on crypto stuff. It's not very many, but it's like, if I can win that 1%, maybe that wins me, Wisconsin or something.
What's fascinating also is like Peter Thiel, one of the most prescient investors in Silicon Valley, I think has also forsaged this development because he was really ahead of the curve on this political transformation. And what I think, so just to make this point, then we can move past it. It seems to me that what's happening today that is unique is that for a long time, Silicon Valley was largely disinterested in politics. There was a libertarian ethos in the Valley. And to the extent that they were interested, it was really larger companies, mega cap companies that were lobbying the government to get, what they wanted to get, what regulations they wanted to get passed. The difference now is I feel like we're at this moment in American history, which happens very few times, where there's a huge realignment that comes along with an opportunity for new players to enter the scene and to obtain political power very quickly. And I feel like that's the opportunity that a lot of people in the Valley are seeing, and they want to be part of that opportunity.
Yeah, look, I guess you have to give Peter Thiel credit now for being, I guess, the first major VC to kind of align himself with Trump. I mean, in his own telling, he thought that Trump was kind of an underpriced asset. Now, I think Peter's also quite conservative, and so it's like not a big leap for him to affiliate with a Republican candidate. But he's like, yeah, I think Trump is more likely to win than the models of the polls show, and therefore I stand to cash in and gain in stature and influence if Trump does win.
So one more question, and then we'll move on from this section. And also, I just want to highlight, like, as you said, there were, I think, 3 major categories in the book. One was obviously the gambling section. The other one covered a lot of this. And then this kind of bled into the conversation about AI. They're all super interesting. I just happened to find this one the most interesting or relevant. One last question about the VC part, and then we'll move on. And that has to do with this concept of being on the spectrum or being a, quote, autist.
Yeah.
First of all, what is this? When did this really become something that people thought about? I mean, in the past, being autistic meant being Rain Man from the movie Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise. People didn't really know what Asperger's was, I feel like, on the mainstream until like maybe Michael Lewis wrote The Big Short and everyone learned about the guy that was played by...
Oh, I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
Why am I blanking on the guy's
There's like
name?
this contagious thing where when some person forgets a name, the other person forgets too.
Yeah, there are too many names here. So what does it mean to be on the spectrum, and how closely does this perception actually align with the reality of Silicon Valley?
I think there's some overlap in the Venn diagram, but it's not perfect. For one reason, I talked to Simon Baron-Cohen, who's actually related to Sacha Baron Cohen, and is like the world's foremost autism researcher. And they have a definition of autism spectrum disorder that can be diagnosed with like 5 criteria. So one of them might be having trouble reading social cues, for example. It may also be having problems with different types of perception and things like that. But the point is, these are 5 things that are kind of only loosely related. It's not really one thing, right? It's like kind of a set of attributes that I think in some ways is helpful and in some ways is unhelpful. I mean, the term I like more is like neurodivergent or non-neurotypical. I mean, who really is typical anymore? I don't know. The stereotype of single-minded pursuit and the kind of stereotype of not caring as much about kind of what society thinks, like that's probably helpful in Silicon Valley and probably helpful in certain other areas in the river. However, like the stereotypical autistic person is someone who is kind of risk averse, right? They want routine and predictability. And like, that's not what you get if you're in the river, if you're gambling and things like that. So it's people who fit some parts of the stereotype and not others. Certainly there is tolerance in Silicon Valley for people who are socially awkward. I wouldn't, want to diagnose without knowing somebody exactly who would classify themselves as on the spectrum. And people also use it sometimes as like a term of endearment or like self-deprecation, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm a little spectrum-y, right?
Kind of like the way the Brits use the C word.
Yeah. And it's kind of saying, look, I mean, one loose analogy, like if it's kind of like what region someone's, they're like, oh, I'm Southern. You know what I mean? It's like, it kind of tells you some things and it's not perfect, but like there's some part of the human map is, on the spectrum, but I don't think it's quite the same as, and there are also some like very charismatic founders in the river and like to play poker or something. Poker is usually people with medium social skills, right? If you have really high social skills plus some mathematical skills, and probably you go work for an investment bank or something and kill it that way, right?
Yeah.
If you have really low social skills, then it becomes hard to read people, hard to, you don't need much of a network in poker, but it helps to have friends and things like that. So it's usually, very high analytical skills, medium social skills is kind of the personality type that I'm used to.
Yeah, it's funny because it used to be a exclusively pejorative term, like who wanted to be called autistic or on the spectrum. But I feel like I remember in 2017, late 2017, early 2018, when the last funding cycle was peaking, there were so many people I was meeting in the city who were almost like performatively autistic.
Yeah.
They were like doing it on purpose because that had become like a signal, a heuristic that people were using to decide whether or not someone was investable.
I mean, SBF, who I think by his own admission is, on the spectrum and said that in his court filings asking for more leniency in sentencing, he definitely played up into the stereotype on purpose, right? He's like, well, they want the next like Mark Zuckerberg. Although Zuckerberg's interesting because now Zuckerberg's doing like all this kind of cool shit and like remaking his image. It's kind of,
he's got in shape, he's doing jujitsu.
So maybe it's more performative than, it's partly a performance, right? It also can be that like, look, if you're single-minded and have intense focus, like I think that's probably a helpful characteristic overall. Yeah, it's interesting how, from an evolutionary...
Elizabeth Holmes also was sort of dialing that up. She was cranking that up when she was doing media, deepening voice, kind of being sort of weirdly antisocial.
Yeah, I think these people have more acute social sensibilities than they might let on, right? I mean, I don't know. I mean, they're complicated people, but they have like some highly functional social, I don't know if they're the nicest people in the world, but they have something that works. And I think a certain type of unconventional magnetism in some cases.
Well, they're clearly very smart. I mean, the intersection that's relevant for your book is they're clearly very smart and they are willing to take risk. And that convergence leads to giant payouts. So before we get into the 2024 election, let's talk a bit about, which we'll discuss in the second hour, let's talk a little bit about what you mentioned in the beginning of the book, which is Well, I don't know if you mentioned it, but it was an important part of the book, which was your observation that risk preferences were bifurcating and some of the stuff that you observed during the course of the pandemic. First of all, how long have you been actively observing the risk preferences of people around you? And when did you first begin to realize that those risk preferences were changing?
I quit my job as consultant in 2004 to go play poker on the internet. So, I played poker before I ever built like an election forecast or anything like that. So I've kind of been in and around this world for a while now.
That was back with like Poker Stars and Party Poker.
Party Poker, Poker Stars, Pacific Poker. I'm trying to remember all the...
Where were you based at the time? Were you in New York?
Chicago.
Okay.
Yeah. And we just kind of, stay up until 4 a.m. playing poker and then nap for 2 hours and go into work and be extremely ineffective at work. At some point, like I didn't even know how the printer worked, right? The printer changed. Like I didn't have to print anything. So I was not really just kind of faking my way through the workday. But yeah, so I was part of this original poker boom inspired by online poker, and Chris Moneymaker was won an online qualifier like on Poker Stars, and then actually won the real World Series of Poker. So he was an amateur who won this $2 million prize and was a very good story for poker. But yeah, I mean, look, I've always really been into like sports analytics and things like that. I've always been kind of fascinated by markets and by numbers and things like that. So in some ways, this world is the world that I've always kind of explored in different ways. But I think it's kind of COVID, I think, is some type of inflection point potentially, where it kind of feels like the guardrails are off a little bit post-COVID, and maybe during COVID for some people. I think people felt like, okay, well, here are all these experts that we're supposed to trust, but they kind of keep contradicting themselves, and maybe I don't trust them that much, and I kind of have to figure out for them myself, am I really going to like have my kids out of school for a year, right? Is that really going to work for me? And then post-COVID, it kind of feels like some of the experts have been a little bit discredited by some things. If you look at like trust in institutions, trust in every major institution in America, right? The media and academia, public health, tech also. I mean, trust in big business has declined. Everything except the military, ironically, still has pretty good perceptions, but like the, views of the church have declined because of scandals and other things. So if you don't have any institutions you can trust, then you kind of have to figure things out on your own. And that, I think, brings out people's either risk tolerance or risk aversion.
So that's interesting. I actually hadn't thought about that angle from reading your book. What I did find super interesting that you talked about was that you suggested that perhaps this larger risk appetite for gambling or like, YOLOing on GME comes from a misalignment in our society around risk-taking in the economy, that there aren't opportunities to take risks that lead to larger economic gains for society as a whole. So for example, like moonshots or like, exploring the Louisiana territory, stuff that people used to do that maybe is something that's deeply biological for lots of people, that's no longer available. So you find those people at slot machines.
Yeah, no, look, I literally talked to an astronaut for the book, this amazing woman named Catherine Sullivan, who was studying oceanography of all things and like beat out 10,000 other people for a slot in NASA's first class that included women, along with Sally Ride. And she clearly has like this fighter pilot coolness under pressure, risk-taking mentality. I mean, she was active during the period when the Challenger explosion happened, and in NASA, before you go on a mission on the space shuttle, then you actually tell your loved ones, give them a conditional goodbye, because you never know what's going to happen when you're like literally in outer space. But, now that we're not in the age of space exploration, now that we're not in the age of, there are wars around the world, right? But not in the United States. Yeah, acts of bravery or heroism or risk-taking that might once have involved physical labor or physical risk now are kind of transferred to, hey, you make your once a year trip to Vegas and gamble too much and get too drunk and things like that and go to the strip club. And like, there's a kind of transference there, I think. Because one thing I found too is like, again, most of the book is about financial risk taking, but there is one chapter about physical risk takers and their mentality. I talked to mountain climbers and military commanders and things like that, astronauts. Their mentality is more similar than you would think. The ability to perform well under pressure is rare, and to embrace that is pretty rare. But they're also very practiced, right? They're not just winging it. They're people who are intensely dedicated to their craft, are able to be very focused and attentive, and, are not going to back away from anybody.
I thought this was part, and we'll move on it because we have so much to talk about, but I just thought this was one of the more fascinating parts of the book, the way that this made me consider the misalignment in incentives in our economy in a way that I hadn't. I mean, I've thought about it before, but not in this particular way. I think it also falls in the category of sort of speaking to Peter Thiel's "so where's my flying car" argument, right? We keep putting out new and new Marvel movies, and part of it's kind of like this hyper-capitalism, sort of late-stage capitalism thing going on where the economy is actually not super risk-averse. And I think that might have something also to do with the lack of government investment at the early stage of the economic cycle. So I want to recommend also people listen to my episode with Bill Janway on the innovation economy, and also an episode with Safi Bakal called Moonshots or Loonshots, where we talked about this. We talked about Vannevar Bush, for example. And that's where William Shockley's Traitors 8 came from, right? They came from an environment where the government played a much bigger role in seeding early stage innovation and creating opportunities for people to take risks that they didn't have to take with their own capital, right? But they were able to take with the government's capital, and it yielded really positive investments.
Yeah, and now the biggest category in tech, and maybe the world right now, is AI, which is being developed almost entirely privately, right? So it's different than the Manhattan Project, or different than kind of the seed investments and kind of the quasi, like Bell Labs and things like that's a private company, but kind of has some of the feeling of they would hire academics more. And now a lot of these VCs are like, oh yeah, we don't want to hire academia, right? We want to hire people who didn't go to college. And Peter Thiel's paying people not to go to college and instead found companies when they're in their teens and 20s and things like that.
Totally. And you can also see how this, to go back to my point about the innovation cycle and the government's role, you can see how we're struggling to do this now. So the U.S., the Biden administration has been trying to enact an industrial policy. J.D. Vance and Trump and that team is also kind of looking to do the same thing. And one area we would really struggle with that is with semiconductors. So we're really good at putting on export controls, but we're having a difficult time also figuring out how do we actually provide the capital to these companies so that even though they're losing market share and they're losing income, that they can then reinvest in innovation and research. How do we supplement that? That whole thing is still coming together, and a lot of it's just lost muscle memory. So one last question, and then I'm going to move to the second hour, Nate. Why does it matter? Because this is something you talked about. You said that risk preferences are bifurcating. First of all, what do you mean by that? And why does it matter if risk preferences are bifurcating for society?
I think it's partly a problem if bifurcating, I just mean that you don't have a bell curve type distribution.
Right, the tails are growing.
The tails are growing.
And the belly, and you have a belly distribution.
Or you have two camelback distribution. I think it's kind of a problem if the village is so risk averse, although we're talking about politics in a moment, right? I think they actually made a pretty smart, risky decision to replace Biden. We can talk about that in a second. Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, I think we saw in the pandemic, for example, how a lack of thinking in terms of cost-benefit analysis and expected value terms was costly in a lot of ways, right? I think the evidence is pretty strong that the harms of school closures substantially outweighed the benefits of that, for example. And then you might actually see, you gave the example of Europe before, where maybe it begins to stymie the economy to some extent, and that could cause problems. And meanwhile, look, I'm relatively, kind of lowercase L libertarian, but unregulated capitalism can go wrong too. We saw a big disaster with SBF. Even people who are working for the AI labs will say there's some risk that this goes really badly for civilization, right? And the computers become misaligned with human values and become too smart for us to do anything about it. And that's pretty scary, right? That probably requires some regulation. If you are concerned about wealth inequality, which, I'm not necessarily worried about for its own sake, but the fact that you have the accumulation of power in fewer and fewer hands, right? The 10 richest people in the world are about twice as rich as they were 10 years ago. And if that number keeps doubling every 10 years, or the rates of return for the top VC firms is 20% per year, that just keeps growing and growing until either it stops or it kind of swallows everything and becomes kind of, it's also, Peter Thiel's interest in seasteading and things like that, and kind of having independence from these governments. And he's not a big fan. He thinks democracy is interfering with his ability to let the smart people dominate things. I think that's going way too far.
Super dark
for me, and quite dark. Yeah. And so at the very least, just having shared understanding of these things. At the very least for AI alone, because AI is a very high stakes, potentially high risk bet. And you're going to need people in the village to understand how it works and understand how people in the river and in Silicon Valley think.
Well, this is where the present moment in time in American history and world history has parallels to the period of industrialization, where the change makers in society were creating products that were dramatically upending the economy and the way that people live their lives. You know, the trains, literally the locomotive changed the landscape of America.
Yeah.
It destroyed all the native tribes that lived in the plains. It destroyed the buffalo. So and it destroyed the physical environment. And so you have these massive changes that happen on society that are currently being driven by a small group of private actors. And because the institutions are so corrupted and people's faith in them is so destroyed, it becomes very difficult for us to build a consensus around regulating capitalism in a way that's actually effective. And I think you and I would both agree, and I think this is the smart way to do it. It's not to redistribute money. It's not to tax people afterwards and then take the money. You want to minimize the to tax, and you want to maximize the extent to which the economy's incentives align with the distribution of capital so that people actually come off both, so that inequality is lower and people are actually earning that money themselves. It isn't just being given to them by the government, because that creates a problem of incentives and power. And you're putting more power in the government. You're creating a class of peasants who are basically depending on a populist government to basically hand money in. And every different election, somebody else comes in, somebody hands the money in. So I'm going to move us to the second hour of our conversation, Nate. I want to tease out a little bit of what I want to talk about. First, I want to talk about your forecasting model and polling in general. And then we're going to apply that and your own insights to both Biden's decision to drop out, as well as Camilla's pick for vice president, the choice of J.D. Vance by Donald Trump, the failed Trump assassination, what effect that had on the race, what effect it might continue to have on the race. Also, I'm fascinated to ask for some specific questions about Trump. Like, Trump's been very scripted recently, or at least he has appeared to, but now he's started to go off script again. I'm curious to hear your views on, like, if that's a good idea, if that's not a good idea, Kamala's unfavorability, the effect that a potential debate could have, as well as the vein of conspiratorial thinking. And again, I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but the vein of conspiratorial thinking that also, I think, naturally begins to grow in an environment where there's a loss of trust in institutions, and sort of trying to understand what your forecasting models and your ways of viewing the economy and society tells you about why that is and what effect it could have. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Nate, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Nate, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed.
Cool.
If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.